sometimes people call me Mr. Non-Formal Education, but I've been called lots of things. I also have, I suspect, some credibility as Mr. Theological Education by extension, Mr. TEE. But some of these are based on some partial understandings of where I'm coming from. One of the better ways to get at this is to say, how do you explain being a professor of education in a secular or in an institution of education, higher education, and at the same time being such an advocate of non-formal education? Well, you've got to remember a few things here. First of all, the terminology problem has been very difficult to deal with, because when I was growing up and when I was going through my first educational experiences, there were only two types of education: formal education. Now that's self-defining. Everybody knows what formal education is or means. At least everybody thinks they do, because it sounds like you're talking about schools. Right. That's probably the best word for it: schooling. Formal education is schooling. Informal education is, quite literally, everything else. Like any other negative term, informal or non-formal or negative, any negative prefix is going to take you in the direction of contrasting something with school. Right. Now, the problem is that that doesn't explain anything like the whole of the universe of what's involved in the educating efforts of human beings. There are many things that we do in education that are not done in schools, and yet they're deliberate. For example, when you ask people, where did you learn to swim? Most people will say, well, I learned to swim in swimming class at school. Or, more particularly, I learned to swim because I learned to swim in the river. I learned to swim in the lake. I learned to swim in the real world of water. Now, learning to swim either is organized as a school-type activity, formal education, or it is allowed to happen as a function of experience in life. Fortunately, I was a kid raised in South Florida, and most kids in South Florida in my day didn't learn swimming in school. In fact, schools never heard of swimming classes. We learned to swim in the lakes and the rivers and the ocean, because that's where the water is. And that kind of learning that you do because life brings that to you, or that envelops you in it, is clearly what's known as informal education. Parents have a big part of this, because your parents are very much a part of your upbringing in your childhood. And so we think of all the parenting education that goes on. This is really informal education. There's a better term for it, though. The better term than informal education is the socialization terminology that comes out of the field of educational sociology, which raises the question of what it is that's doing the teaching. It's the society that's doing the teaching, not an institution of society, but it's the society as a whole. Okay, there's the distinction between formal and informal, but the problem is that that still doesn't deal with it. It just gives us a little bit better way to talk about it. There was a study done in Ghana in the 70s, early 70s, by Philip Combs, C-O-O-M-B-S. And Philip Combs, an excellent researcher in the field of education and educational sociology, was being asked to form a set of teams by the government of Ghana, former Gold Coast in West Africa, to help them answer the question of how can you explain the fact that now that we've been free of British control for this many years, I forget how many years it was at that point, 10 years or something like that, and as a kind of a 10-year celebration, we need to study why we haven't been able to make much more impact on our society, even though now we've channeled our educational resources in a different direction than the colonials were putting them. And Philip Combs and his team went in there and looked at that. And the conclusion that Combs came to was that it is not good enough to simply take educational resources that you were putting into higher education and other educational ventures and simply put it into more of the same. What Ghanaians had been doing is take all that money that now was being gathered by their own taxing system and making it available to the educational enterprises, which were the formal educational systems, particularly the universities. And all that money was going into the universities, all that money was going into the educational system, in a formal education system. And Philip Combs made a very astute observation. He says, people can't use that which they're getting from the university effectively in the real world of work to make an impact on a society if they don't have some education in the very process of transforming that into the use of the society. Pretty abstract idea, but very crucial. And as a consequence, the Ghanaians were challenged to shift where they were putting their educational resources and start beefing up the other aspects of their society that were doing education in fact, but were not being recognized for it, and thus to create a tighter linkage between what the formal schools were doing and what the society needed. Now, the British approach to things is heavily school-oriented. And all the British colonies have suffered from this because the whole British system was based upon very rigid, formulaic schooling programs. The Ghanaians said, okay, we'll make the change. That really was the beginning of the terminology non-formal education, because Combs said, I don't know what to call it, but the best I can come up with is non-formal education. That was Philip Combs' own term. And it stuck. Now, I've always complained that that's kind of like giving up too soon on a very important linguistic problem, because you can't have something that is formal and informal and non-formal without confusing the whole world. It's a little bit like defining all your mammalian creatures as either a cat or a non-cat or a super non-cat. Come on now, what are you trying to say there? It is not enough to say non-formal. What you really need is the linkage function in education, the concept of education as a process of making learning available to work in the society. Now, I don't mean necessarily work in a manual labor sense, though it does include that. That we understand. For example, there's hardly a field in the developed world that does not have a great deal of effort and money put into the field of job training. And you take a job as a bricklayer, but you're not expected to do anything as a bricklayer until you have had some training as a bricklayer. Training in truck driving, training in, you just name it, in all the fields of work. But those little pieces of training, even if badly done, are important because they link the knowledge factor that comes out of the larger view of that field and the application of that field and the learnings of that field makes them available in terms of the utilization of that knowledge. That linkage factor is what non-formal education is about. Now, non-formal education is not necessarily a way of doing teaching. It has its motives in the same direction as any other form of education. So anybody who's trained as an educator really ought to understand the breadth of educational applications. And the illustration that perhaps is best is to ask, first of all, where did you learn to speak your first language? Well, I learned my first language before I went to school even. Yes, you surely did. In fact, most people in most societies learn their first language to a functional level that's pretty high in 4.5 years. And in that 4.5 years, you gain all kinds of skills in the use of that language and in the use of the knowledge that you communicate that way. And that is clearly in the socialization responsibility. That is not even planned, it's not staffed, but it's done by somebody, and it is an educational process, and it has a deliberate outcome. Now stop and consider. What is it that schools do to facilitate the continuation of that language learning? They give people a lot of exercises in the use of that language, including literary uses, but more particularly, they teach them how to spell. So with a tongue-in-cheek, I say what school is for is to pick up after 4.5 years at home and teach people how to spell it. And to do that, it takes 12 years. And that gets kind of silly, but that's pretty much the limitation of what the formal schooling delimits itself to doing in terms of language learning. But more particularly, it illustrates how important it is that that language learning be laid down well in that first 4.5 years. And that's not going to be organized, it's not going to be managed, it's not going to be curricularized, it's not going to be controlled by any government or any agency. That's the responsibility of homes and families and neighborhoods. Children who have lived in multilingual neighborhoods generally pick up more than one language. More than one language by the time, again, they're 4.5. So I have seen plenty of kids in this world who can speak 2 and sometimes 3 languages with some degree of competency by the time they're 5, 6 years old. How does that happen? It's not because of schooling. It's because of the non-formal relationships that are built in the society and the way those are used deliberately sometimes to bring a person into a relationship of communication with others in the community. Now, non-formal education, in the sense of deliberate informal education, does make sense. Deliberate is the key word. Informal education is circumstantial and environmental. You learn a lot in the informal, not because somebody says you ought to, but because you will. You learn a lot in the formal because somebody says you must. You learn a lot in the non-formal because you want to. And it's in that wanting to that involves the individual in the process of acquiring skills and competencies, not because they're being compelled to, not because somebody's giving a grade in it, a credit in it, or some other recognition, but because they want to. And the want to factor is the key factor that the Ghanaians were searching for. How do we make these people want to learn? And how do we educate them in such a way that their first impulse isn't to leave the country and go to England and get a better job? Because that's where they were losing their products of their universities. They're still losing them. All over the world, there's a migration of people that are educated from the very nations that have given them the higher formal education into the places where that formal education is even more valued and more rewarded than it is in their home society. That's really the origin of the concept in language. Now, in my own case, being a person starting out in the field of music, that's where I started out, I was very concerned about how people learn music. And most any music teacher learns rather early on that unless you want to be a music historian or a musicologist, you better learn to play an instrument. Better to do 2 or 3, and especially to learn to sing. In other words, it's the doing of music that constitutes the really important facets of music education. And yet what we do with people quite commonly, even in universities and colleges, is teach them a lot of music history and a lot of musicology and many others of the things of music without really teaching musicianship. Now, that's not to say that it's true in general, but that's true across the board in terms of what part of the curriculum is, and the assumption there is that that stuff is just as important as the musicianship. No, it's not. Because it's in the capacity to make music that one comes to understand and feel music. And there's where I think a musician has more awareness of what this distinction between formal education and non-formal education is really all about. This is not to say that all music education is non-formal, by no means. But I do believe that there's a lot more to be learned by a person who has that sensitivity and that awareness. I find very few musicians who can make that distinction conceptually, and I don't think they need to, but it's nice to be able to make the distinction because it allows us to talk more clearly about what it is our concern is. But after having a number of years in the field of music in terms of performance training, it occurred to me that the real important needs in our society in music education are not limited to that kind of performance competency, making everybody, competent as a performer, so much as it is making them competent as a utilizer, as a functionary within, appreciator of, and a contributor to a musicality in society. So those things were lurking in the back of my mind even in college. And at some point later in college, I realistically looked around and looked at my fellow music majors, and I placed myself within that cluster, and knowing how relatively few people really make a career out of music, I said, there's no reason that I knock myself out to do something that I'm not excellent in. And I wasn't an excellent performer. I was a good performer. Quite often, I could describe myself as being a recognized performer, especially in a small town. And I quit aspiring to be something that I never was going to be. I decided instead I was going to become a teacher of music. And to be a teacher of music, I needed to be a performer, yes, but I needed particularly to be aware of the learning processes and to be aware of what the teacher contributes in those learning processes. And consequently, when I got to graduate school at the University of Florida, I found myself in land-grant university, which I did not understand at all. Most people don't understand what it means to be in a land-grant university, but I found out a land-grant university is not just moo-you, the place where people learn how to take care of cows and pigs. It's a place where people value taking care of dogs and pigs and cats. Taking care of the life around us and being involved with it and knowing about it and knowing that alfalfa is not the same thing as corn. That's what it means to be a land-grant university person. Now, beyond the agriculture application, a land-grant university is a manifestation of formal education committed to the support of non-formal education, strangely enough. And it's true in the United States that the Land Grant Act, which was signed into law by President Lincoln, had a tremendous impact on society. Up till that point, most of the higher education resources in the United States were invested in private institutions committed to excellence, however that was defined in the several disciplines. It was not designed to be a general contribution to human welfare. The land-grant universities came along, and the Land Grant Act was a product of the thinking in the early 19th century that said we need to change the way we do it in the United States. If we're really going to have a free society and an open democracy, we're going to have a more broadly educated public, and that broadly educated public has to participate in the benefits of the educational processes. Now, it's that participation in the benefits that really is the crux of the non-formal education of the land-grant system. And the land-grant universities were set up in order that the private university system would have a competitor. It would not be the only game in town. Because at that point, at the middle of the 19th century, the Harvard universities, in their many manifestations, the Colgates and the rest of the whole private university scheme, was intended to deal with the society at the top, intending that somehow it would benefit the whole if that top were highly trained in specializations. And the crux of the Land Grant Act was to say, no, it's got to be a more open way to make it possible for even the children of the farmers to have access to the benefits of an education in a society that's complex and is trying to be more open. Okay. Now, Senator Morrill from Vermont is the key person in that, and that's one reason that all the land-grant universities, somewhere on the campus, is a Morrill building, Morrill. And you look at it, there's a Morrill Hall, and a Morrill Hall. One after another of the universities has this. Now, we're not talking about land-grant universities in terms of the impoverished universities. We're talking about University of Michigan State. We're talking about Ohio State. We're talking about University of Illinois, University of Wisconsin, University of Minnesota, State University of Pennsylvania. I mean, we're talking about some of the real powerhouse schools. And they are in business to educate more broadly the whole of society. Now, what's that got to do with music education, for heaven's sake? What's that got to do with my career? And I come along as a compatriot of the discoverers of the language of non-formal education. And with colleagues from the University of Florida and colleagues at Michigan State, I have learned to put language on this, to put meaning on it, to make it more comprehensible to people, to think in terms of categories that are larger than the ordinary categories of formal education. That's really a contribution that I feel very, very satisfied to have participated with. And consequently, I can identify with the folk of non-formal education about as quickly as I can identify with any. In fact, at Michigan State, when I left Michigan State, I left the Institute for Non-Formal Education in the hands of one of my colleagues who was a new faculty member at the university, whose name was Alimu Biftu. And Alimu Biftu is a very dramatically fine, elegant, highly competent educator from Ethiopia. And I left the institute in his hands as I retired. And I left in place in the College of Agriculture another of my graduates, Joseph Levine. And Joseph Levine is still today one of the outstanding professors in the area of adult learning and non-formal education. Now, these are the sorts of people that I think are going to be involved in a future in which the educational climate of this nation, and perhaps the educational climate of the world, shifts in the direction of a more functional orientation in education. Where did I learn those values? I learned those values from Aunt Mabel. But I saw them acted out in my mother and my father. I saw them acted out in terms of what was going on in my own life and what was going on in my own experiences as a kid. The difference was I was thinking about it. I was aware of what was going on. I was naming it. I named my world early. I hung on to a vision for a transformed world that would move in the direction of a more broadly available resource for the development of learning in society. Now, that's the connection. How does that connect? You have to go back over that and say, oh, wow, this is a real leap from teacher education to music education to theological education. Now let's just take theological education as a case in point. Theological education is awfully complex way of talking about training people to be effective in ministry. And theological education is not just concerned with giving people theological information, though quite often they behave as if that's all they have to do. I think it's involved in getting people to be effective leaders, and to be effective leaders in a model of leadership that is more Christ-like than it is like human society's attempts to create the alternatives. To create a Christ-like leadership, you need an enterprise of the society coming together around the idea of a shared experience and a shared concern for implementing and acting on the things of God. Now, I don't know whether we all agree on the language here at this point, but I'll tell you this, for this person, it's quite adequate for me to think of that as being the church. I think it's in the church and the church's relationships where some of us have learned, this is not a new thought, not a new idea, it's an old learning. We've learned how to support each other, we've learned how to work together, we've learned how to focus on a truth that actualizes a different kind of life, a more productive, a more God-like life, a more God-satisfying life. And this is the good news of the gospel. That's what it's all about. Now, why can't theological seminaries grasp that? I don't know. It's possibly because they're too busy teaching. And they may be teaching too busily around the idea of passing on information. And if their model of teaching and learning is an informational one, that's what they're stuck with. If it's an experiential learning that they're after, they're going to have to go somewhere else to do it. And there is the big rub. Because sometimes if the institution is not tuned to the values that the institution is advocating, the institution can pull people away from those values as quickly as it can to fulfill those values. I learned this at the University of Florida. At the University of Florida, I found myself among a group of people that were very committed to making a relationship happen among the faculty and the students. And I'm talking about the graduate faculty at the University of Florida, especially the graduate faculty of education, concerned about helping people develop a perspective on themselves, on life, on the values of life, and on the needs of a society that would be a fully orchestrated manifestation of the values that they were trying to teach. In order to do that, we had to do things together. I learned the value of community in land-grant university, not in a Christian college. Now, truly, we had a community, but it was not a real commitment to that community. The community that I learned in Christian college was a community of happenstance. And what I learned at the University of Florida was that you have to have a community of people who are aware of their differences and are working like crazy to relate to each other effectively despite those differences. Not bringing people into uniformity and then asking them to talk to each other. Very different. Very different. And it was in that university where I discovered that my professors, in so many cases, it was just a happy time at the university in that period in the 50s and 60s. A lot of our faculty at the University of Florida then were former faculty from Columbia, Teachers College. My office mate at the University of Florida, my first office mate, was a woman whose husband was a journalist, and he was a world traveler. And together they had been world travelers. They were separated. But she was a fascinating woman, Eleanor Bodie Brown. And she had been a student of John Dewey. And she was the first direct student of John Dewey that I ever ran into. Later at the University of Florida, I found that they were thicker than fleas. You could find them all over the place, people that had worked with John Dewey. And John Dewey's influence on the University of Florida was profound at that point. Now, I will have to confess that there are many things about John Dewey and his philosophy and his orientation of life that are not sympathetic with mine, but on the other hand, there's an awful lot about John Dewey that I do value and I do appreciate, and I do particularly evaluate him as an excellent educational philosopher, and one that I think we can learn from. Now, many of the folk that I was working with at that time were similarly committed to a let's learn from John Dewey, let's try very hard to come to his value system, and let's understand it, let's put it to work, let's judge it, and see where it leads us. And for many Christians, that's difficult, because you first of all have a person like John Dewey who is so obviously not committed to an educational orientation, to a Christian orientation, that you want to write him off and you want to avoid thinking about it. That is not a very good posture for an educator. It's not a very good posture for an educated person. It's much better that we say there are ideas in this world with which I will not agree. There are ideas that I will not salute. But they're ideas that I must confront, I must deal with, I must appreciate, I must see them for the good that's in them and recognize them for the non-good that is in them. But I must, first of all, grasp what the whole of it means and how it leads us. I think this is what we were doing at the University of Florida at that time. We were just trying very hard to make the best possible sense out of what John Dewey was saying. And John Dewey was a door opener for me and for many. And he led me into directions that I might not otherwise have observed. Let me give you an example of that. I would have never really paid much attention to Jean Piaget, the French philosopher of education, had it not been for the introduction I had through my colleagues at the University of Florida who had known Dewey. And the knowing Dewey was so important in their lives that knowing Jean Piaget became easy for me. And I came to know Jean Piaget, through whom I've learned many another person, including I've known such person as Paulo Freire. And Paulo is certainly one of the most inspiring people of the 20th century, as an educator and as a philosopher. His contributions to the world in terms of the non-formal education experiences, dramatic, powerful. Now, fitting all that together for a little boy from a small town in South Florida who really has to learn an awful lot in order to move into a world that is as complex as I have to live in now. I'm not sure it would have been possible, apart from some of the mixture of experiences and the sources that I've been privileged to participate with. So I'm thankful for the background. I'm thankful for the origins. I'm thankful for the contributions that have been made along the line. And I'm thankful to be here today to say it's fun to watch it happen, and it's fun to be part of it. Where's the world going with all that? I don't know. Where are we going nationally? And this time is particularly difficult for me to imagine where we're headed, because I see us so easily giving back many of the hard-earned progress elements. We've taken a loose hold on a lot of stuff that's very important. And I think we've allowed ourselves to be motivated by fear and by fright and motivated by preservation instincts, self-preservation instincts. As a graduate professor, I've come to the conclusion, and that's a conclusion that I've tried hard to share with my fellow learners and my students, that we first of all must respect and value the important things that have made the society what it is, and that have made us free to be what we are. And after that, we do, yes, have to be concerned about preservation of those values, but we don't necessarily do well to start with the preservation issues. If we really mean business about morality in a society, we have to be aware of the likelihood that giving things up has to be approached with care lest we give up the wrong things. And if we are not careful, we can be bargained out of the very things that make for a competent, effective life. The experiences that I've had in varieties of education and in situations where educational resources are put to work range so widely that I've seen this operate in strange and wonderful ways. In working in so-called third world countries, where I spent a great deal of my time, after my previous discussions of time in universities, my most satisfying work with the universities was in the relationships we had with other institutional forms overseas. Working with institutional forms that were in many cases at odds with our universities, but nevertheless, because we were a land-grant university, we had an willingly accepted responsibility to deal with those other institutional forms in their own terms. It was so difficult for some of our faculty to make that adjustment so that we were not simply exporting ourselves, but we were exporting our values in a framework that could be effectively integrated into their societies and into the reshaping of their institutions. Our university was invited by USAID and other agencies to rework the universities in a number of backward countries and rework them in such a way that they could get on their feet and become part of a world of intellectual exchange. Perhaps the greatest satisfaction was in dealing with people who at first we would deal with on terms that we would wonder if we would ever be able to make any impact on them. And our temptation was to assume that our measuring of the impact that we might make was in terms of what we can do to change them. And little by little, I guess we all in our group of faculty and group of participants, little by little we would learn that that's not what it's all about. It's not changing them. It's participating with them as they are changing themselves. The actor had to be them, not us. We weren't acting upon them. Now, when you begin to grasp that, you see that the role of the educator becomes a very different one. It becomes very much less a matter of bringing something to them and making the changes in them. It becomes much more a matter of bringing ourselves into a situation where we can open ourselves to really grasp what's going on. This is where you really learn to listen. That's hard for a lot of Americans, to really effectively listen. If you listen closely or watch closely the things that are said politically, even in today's climate, it's pretty rare to hear the politician who talks about learning from anybody else. And it's very much more likely that the person is going to tell what he's going to do so that other people will understand what he understands. But that's not where it was at. Our faculties at the University of Florida and then at Michigan State had to learn the hard way, in many cases, how to listen effectively, and on the basis of what we were gathering from the listening, be in a participating relationship. And it's in that opening to listen that we could then begin to hear and find ways to put ourselves into that situation so that what we would share back in return would not only reciprocate what we were hearing, but it would create even new combinations that were beyond what they had experienced and beyond what we had experienced. Now, our universities were transformed by that when it happened, but so often it didn't happen. And it didn't happen because by matters of policy or by matters of practice, we were not good listeners. But that's really the craft of effective international work. It begins with good, careful listening. And out of that listening grows a respect and a sharing that can bring two very different entities together in ways that can interlock with each other productively and constructively. These were some of the more important characteristics. I enjoyed that period of time because it was, I think there were about 80 of us at Michigan State that were in that particular sector of the faculty that were identified as international specialists. And we were from all kinds of fields. And we were from everything from horticulture to public health to all the fields of the scientific realm, and social scientists such as myself and educators who were concerned about how we effectively put our resources together with folk in other parts of the world, and how we work minimally offensively and maximally constructively. We weren't experts at it, but we learned as we went along, and I think we did learn.
How did this energize the students that were part of that period in your life as well?
The universities were able thus to involve graduate students particularly in exchanges and times of exposure in other societies. I think one of the most satisfying experiences I ever had along this line was with one of my students, Richard Crespo, Dick Crespo. Dick Crespo had been a member of the InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, and he was on their international staff. And he'd worked in many parts of the world. His father was from Colombia, and he himself was nicely bilingual, Spanish and English, and a sharp learner, much younger than I am, but he was a very quick learner, very short guy, and for a Latin, very, very blonde. He's kind of a strange little fellow. He married his wife was a Finn. She was from Finland, and she was very, very blonde, and it was a real combination. And he was such a delight. But it gave me a great thrill to be able to appoint him to a role in Ecuador, to work in community development in Ecuador at the request of the Ecuadorian government in the field of health and development and community welfare. And he did a phenomenal job, just unbelievable. Now, because of the relationships, it was possible not only for him to learn, but it was possible for me to learn with him and alongside him. And from time to time, I would show up in his domain and buckle up and learn with him in the field. And we did a lot of interesting work in the field and had some exciting experiences as a consequence of the kind of warmth and openness of relationship that he built with those folk in the mountain tribes of Ecuador. And his work was regarded as widely accepted, and the folk appreciated what was being done with and for them. But it wasn't because we were giving them something. We just loaned them a person who would listen and work well with them. And he did listen and work well with them. And many of the things that came out of that particular project and the dissertation that he built out of that, his doctoral dissertation, was built in the rural Ecuadorian village where he worked, and it's a beautiful thing. And it describes a relationship in which he learned how to orient those people to a different view of health and welfare, simply because of several principles that he'd identified with them as being the most important health principles that they could possibly identify. One was, get your water from upstream. Now stop and think about it. These are people who generally would grab water wherever they could get it. And what they would do would pay no attention to whether it was upstream or downstream from the very waste they were dumping in the river, the creek. Get your water upstream. Well, even that much reduction of bacteria was enough to make a difference. Another of the principles that he taught was eat more than one kind of food in a week. So, good grief, what do you mean more than one kind of food? Well, these were people that ate seasonally, and they ate whatever was growing. So they were potato eaters during potato season. And they were corn eaters during corn season. They had very little notion of what to do other than to eat it when it's first available. Consequently, their diet was just literally all screwed up. Now, he could have gone in there and tried to teach a series of vitamin principles or a series of diet principles, and it would have been totally abstract and away from their world. Their world was impacted by try to eat more than one kind of food in the week. And another principle was do your business in the same place each time. Now, I'm not going to get too elaborate on this, but I think the point is, if you've got people that are simply living on a countryside, they may do their business wherever they happen to be. Now, by doing their business, I'm referring to bodily functions. He taught them how important it was to keep doing it at the same place. And little by little, they learned how to do it at the same place, but they selected their places so that it was not quite so annoying in the general of society because they were doing it in the same place. Now, that's the first step toward building yourself a decent bathroom. And when you're dealing with villagers who don't have anything going for them, that is a whole lot better than doing nothing. And it's a whale of a lot better than teaching them all the principles about hygiene. Another thing of the 4 principles he taught them was wash your dishes after each meal. These were people who were in the habit of using the same utensils, wooden bowls, and crude forks and spoons, crude spoons really. And they were doing this same bowl and the same spoon 3 meals a day, and whatever accumulation was left on it was left on it. And with the shift of those 4 principles, get your water upstream. Well, you heard the principles. They were actually able to make, in a relatively short period of time, I think about a 6-month period, they did the evaluations, they were changing the health standards in that community. Holy cats, now that's really making sense. You see, it's not the technology of formal education. It's not the findings of science. It's the consequences of science as they hit the reality of life. And you deal with them at the points where they make the greatest impact. And that's exactly what Crespo was doing. I just loved that experience with Crespo. But it dozens of other experiences with dozens of other people doing the same kinds of things in different places. And that to me was very satisfying, very rewarding to see what was happening when people would draw from the realities of life, those crucial spots that they could make a difference and make an impact just by sharing simple ideas and persuading people of simple change and getting them to try things and see what difference it would make. These, to me, were the very satisfying years. Today, where can we do that in the matter of leading the Church of Jesus Christ? I don't know. I really don't know, because I've seen so few examples of it. But I tell you where I think it's going to happen. I think it's going to happen in the urban churches. And I think it's going to happen in places where people are already coming together who are from such wide varieties of backgrounds that they are motivated to find the common denominators in life that really make sense across the board. Instead of putting the emphasis on what makes us unique and what makes us different and getting together a whole 25 or 30 people that are just like me, to get together in groups of people that say, okay, we come out of different backgrounds and we have different kinds of things, and share those differences and come to an understanding of those differences and accept those differences as part of the reality of life. One of the reasons that I think it's so important that people in the church learn to eat together is so that they learn to eat different kinds of food. Now that almost sounds like a Dick Crespo principle. Eat different kinds of food with different kinds of people. Get somehow to broaden out the habits that are restricting in your life, that make you marked out as a unique set of people that are uniquely alike. Until we deal with people that are different, we're really not experiencing life.
Now, today, 77 years old, birthday 2 days ago, you had this rich life of experience, learning. You're still learning. You're doing your linguistic thing again in these years. You are refusing to use the term theological education. And you're doing it quite deliberately.
Mm-hmm.
Why?
Because I think sometimes anytime you're using a word that's bigger than people are thinking, you're setting up a conflict barrier. I don't think people think with the word theological. If I say music education is not near as problematic as if I say theological education. Music is not a big word. What are you studying? Spanish. Now, that's maybe a trade illustration, but it's part of why I'm reasoning the way I'm reasoning. It just is not necessary to think bigger than the way people are thinking. I'll tell you where I really learned this. I learned this with reference to the applications of technology. You see, I have a career that spans the commitment in World War II to the sound on film, the SOF. The SOF will do everything you need to do in teaching, was the maxim in 1940. The sound on film will do everything. And a lot of people tried it. And it does a lot. But it doesn't do everything. And in fact, the SOF almost vanished and took with it some of its offspring, such as the film strip, because it didn't do everything. And people who were presuming that the technology would create change didn't understand the change process. And what I discovered was that part of the problem is when you bring a technology into a situation where the technology itself is alien to experience, you got two battles. You got some new information, that's battle enough, but you got some new technology. When you bring any kind of technology into the scene and try to use it to communicate information, people will not hear the information, but they will hear the technology. The best place perhaps to illustrate this was when the blackboard or the chalkboard was replaced by the overhead projector. And it was for a period of time. The overhead projector was more fascinating than whatever the motion that had been taught by the overhead projector. I can recall oodles of times when by bringing a transparency in with an overhead projector, I'd get people coming to see the transparency and see the projector. Now, I learned that in American classrooms. But where it really came home to me as a problem was when I started taking that technology overseas to places that barely had the electricity available, and any available electrical circuit that I could get hold of would run my projector. Maybe sometimes run it very dimly, but it would run it. And I quit that after the first 2 or 3 tries. I quit that. This is not important. What's really important is the content, the stuff of this, the the ideas. And I began to say, there's got to be some better way to teach. There's got to be some better way to communicate. And then it's when I learned, hey, you know what? The good Lord gave me a voice. And gave me some hands. I can do things with those hands. I can do things with models in the sky. How do you describe a cloud? You describe a cloud with your hands. You don't have to have a slide. You don't have to have a picture. You have some reality out there. Some people have something to start with. You say, all right, the massive clouds that came because of the tremendous storm. You can create the storm and people can see it and feel it. Don't take technology in beyond where the people are already using the technologies. And I still believe that's true.
Okay, link that back now to your starting place, theological education, which does not equal theological school. So are you suggesting part of the problem is that in making those synonymous?
There's no way to separate it.
Okay.
There's no way to separate it because theological education is a term that you use only in reference to theological education, as we would think of as the schools to train pastors or to train theologians. Now, that's big words on big words.
Okay, I'm trying
I
to
encountered an experience one time in Africa. Trying to think of the country, possibly Nigeria. When asked to define theological school, that wasn't even the abstraction of theological education. It was a theological school. How do you define a theological school? Oh, theological school, that's a place where, now listen close, a place where little boys go to get big heads. Now that's about as functional as you can possibly make the definition. The little boys in question illustrate the fact that theological schools have put their emphasis on, if you please, the children of the faith, to try to make them as soon as possible eligible for the ranks of faith. So you create a reverend in a person who's only 20, 21 years old, because that person now has been theologically educated. He has his MDiv or his whatever. But in societies that don't venerate youth, that's an insult. Your age, your experience in life in the American society are not as important. But on the world scene, they're terribly important in many societies, most societies. So to take a juvenile and turn him into a pastor is a dangerous thing to do. And especially if you set up a machine that'll do that. Now, what's the name of that machine? A theological school. So the person with some tongue-in-cheek says the theological school is a place where little boys go to get big heads. Now, look at the big heads parts of that. Person who's stuffed with information. Whether or not the person is acting on that information, living that information, whether or not that information has made any transformation in that life. A place where little boys go to get big heads. Now, whenever I think of theological school, that's all I can think of, because I learned that in Africa. Because the fellow that was answering my question, what is a theological school, said exactly that. And he was dead right. There's the rub.
You spent a lot of time in the university, a lot of time working with USAID. You've seen a lot of changes in the university. You were formed in your early education experience, community development experiences, family experiences. What are you still doing? What if you'd like to see the difference in what? You would like to make a difference in thinking about or doing?
Well, I tell you that the thing that I'm most motivated by is something that I wish I could be doing more with. So I'll answer your question, but I'll have to admit that for once in my life, I can't say, and that's exactly what I'm doing. I would like to see the day come when people would more fully recognize that the educational processes of the defunct institution called theological education happen best in the local churches. Now, that's a lot of syllables to say. I think you've got to start training pastors out of the leadership that's emerging in the local churches. Not that every church is generating its own pastors, but I do think that that has got to become more functionally an integrated part of the formation of the person who is the pastor. And in another way of thinking about it, I'm less concerned about juvenile pastors than I was earlier in life. When one is of an age, one presumes that age is going to be the answer for everything. And I think we kind of learned after World War II that that's not going to be the case. But we haven't put it to work. We've still lived as if somehow we're the model. And now at 77, I know I'm not the model. But I do think that there's something to be said for allowing people to mature in the faith before accepting responsibilities. When I look at the definitions, the criteria for the qualification of the deacon in the Scripture, and the qualifications for the elder, the only real distinction for the elder that's not given in the list of qualities for the deacon is the matter of experience in the faith. Paul warns against appointing deacons who are new Christians. There's got to be some wisdom there. It takes time to mature. And I think sometimes we appoint not only deacons, but we appoint elders, for heaven's sake, and pastors who are only just barely dried off from being wet behind the ears. We've just got to think in terms of more a mature function of leadership for the church. And that means that we may want to think in the future of more, whether we're talking about at home or abroad, the mission career being for people who are already experienced. I really despair of the greenhorn missionary. So many are unprepared, and they're not going to become more prepared by doing more schooling. So I'm not as gung-ho as I used to be about what can happen when kids like myself just get out of college and want to go to France. See, God knew better. And it took me a while to catch on. God says, you ain't going to France, but I want to see that you're ready to. That's what my life meant to me. So at first we were disappointed and almost felt guilty. And then it became clear over time that that's the point. You don't have to be instantly able to do things that are that complicated and that demanding. You need some growing up time. You need some maturing time. And I value that now.
Talking about lifelong learning.
Yep. I'm talking about lifelong learning in contrast with this presumption that the whole thing is the schooling you get within the first 16, 20 years of life. That schooling, in the long run, is not that crucial to the whole of the thing. If someone asks me, where did you learn to be a teacher? I would have to say, honestly, I have never finished learning to be a teacher. And I would certainly hope that a person who's asked the question, where did you learn to be a teacher, a leader in the church? I would certainly hope a person would take a certain degree of humility and say, well, I'm not sure I've learned it all yet. But it's something along that line that really motivates me. I think of these things differently because I think in longer time frames. And maternity has a different kind of meaning for me today.
Now, from this vantage point in life, for people who are today thinking about the development of educational opportunities or experiences for this generation, what would you say to them?
Well, let me turn that into a little more functional question. What are the matters and issues that I would regard as fundamental in accepting a person into some kind of an educational process or learning process, which is intended for the purpose of developing leadership, developing higher level skills? If that's anything like your question, let me try to deal with that. First, I would doubt very seriously that it would be an assumption that in a certain limited period of time, a person can mature into the qualities of life, qualities of behavior and function that really are required. So I would hope not to have to deal with a closed frame time. One of the things that always disturbed me in PhD programs is that we say you will get out of here in 7 years. Now, I understood the dynamics of the institutional pressure to get that to happen, but I also knew that it was in many cases silly and impossible. Instead, I would say, let's just find some way to get an educational process going here that can deliver with and in you as much and whatever of the sort of things that you're really going to need as possible. So, good grief, I need a better promise than that because I don't want to start paying bills now that I'll have to keep paying for 15 years. Right, there's the pressure. We've got to pay for things. It's a problem, but it's a problem that I think we've got to find ways to solve. I would far rather deal with people who are in a learning context, in a life context, that allows them to be continuing learners. Think of it this way. If I'm dealing with the ideal advanced degree student, I would hopefully be dealing with a person who's got all kinds of time, but a person who's already in the habit of not wasting it. It's the combination of those two things, I think, that's very crucial. Sometimes we assume that we can make time pressures on things, and that'll keep people from wasting their time. No, it won't. But you can try, but it won't. You've got to have people who are already learning how to do this business of time management, and who then can put within that a high motivation to refine and develop their competencies to the extent that they're going to be satisfied with them. One of the things that I would not do, I would not presume that a person is going to be ideally a PhD no matter who he is or she is. Nah, come on. I don't want that kind of PhD floating around. I'd just as soon give up my own degrees to facilitate others to be less degree oriented. I'd rather have them be concerned about the evidences of excellence that come in doing a work effectively, doing a ministry effectively, in which they can be very satisfied that what they're doing is a providential act of God in the lives of others. Now, I also would want to be concerned that I'm not dealing with people who are using the learning experience to gain experience. I'd like to see persons who've already learned how to row a boat show up at my sailing school. If I'm going to teach people to operate a sailboat, I want people who already know how to paddle pretty well. And I think we get too many people that don't even know how to swim showing up at our theological swimming or sailing schools. So that's one of the things. I think you've got to blend those things all together and ask, what sort of a person are you really after? You're after a person who has experience that they've sought out and utilized well. But you're also after a person who has an awareness of where she or he is in the learning processes of life and can utilize the kind of help you can provide. Now, to do that, you've got to be pretty simple and humble about what you can provide. Because the way we do schools is not a good exemplar of the preparation that most people need. We ask people to be professors who sometimes themselves are very needy people. And we expect something good to happen because they are skilled or knowledgeable about a certain sector. We teach these several sectors and somehow expect the sectors to kind of enlighten one another and flow together. They don't. It's just isolated. You talk to any of the people who are studying at Trinity, for example, any of the people studying at Trinity, and ask them how much they're getting out of their Hebrew classes, how much they're getting out of their Greek classes. 1 person in 5, very close to that, will say, oh, this has been a very valuable experience. But if you ask even that person, why has it been valuable? You get an odd assortment of answers. And I know I've tried this. You get odd assortment of answers. And oftentimes it has very little to do with what the Hebrew structure and language ought to be providing for the background of a person who is in ministry. It's just another one of these banks of skills you check in and check out. And whether, it just grieves me to see how much time we waste doing things that are categorically, historically named and legitimate because they've been done for years. And yet, what difference is it supposed to make? Most people know what homiletics is about, but they have to be taught what homiletics is about. It's just a name that's stuck on a category of thought. I'm all in favor of sticking the right name on it, but I think for many people it is not a useful name. Exegesis is an elaborate terminology for explaining something. What class are you in? Explaining something 202. Doesn't sound very good, but exegesis 202 sounds fine. Simply because you don't know what exegesis means. And what's the source? Exegesis deals more with what is the source of your explaining something. Okay, yes, that's the refinement of it. I get so sick and tired of all those distinctions that are noised abroad. I just wish somebody would simply start over again and use the simple, direct language without resorting to any kind of Greek or any kind of Hebrew or any kind of Latin, for crying out loud, and just say, what are you trying to accomplish?